The year is 1821 and Mexico is finally free from the yoke of the Spanish. It's a time of bloody turmoil, but many folks in Mexico believe in a bright future, a future in which it'll surpass its northern neighbor in a myriad of ways. Yet the seeds of the US will grow into a colossus of a tree, and Mexico's growth will be somewhat stunted. Why did things happen this way? Let's start from the beginning. As you probably know, in the 1500s, the powerful Spanish Empire got busy colonizing the Americas. Spanish conquistadors arrived in droves looking to expand the empire, using their superior weapons and superior military strategic knowledge to lay waste to anyone that stood in their way. The indigenous people fought nobly, but were no match for the Spanish. This led to the conquest of the Aztec Empire, led by the conquistador Hernán Cortés. From 1519 to 1521, the Aztecs and the Spanish fought bloody battles, with the Spanish being significantly helped by the Aztecs' local enemies. You don't need to know the ins and outs of that war for today's show, but you do need to know that the Spanish won, and in 1521 they named their conquered territory New Spain. New Spain was certainly a feather in the cap of the Spanish. There were precious resources there that could add to the great wealth of a country already bursting at the seams with cash, gold, silver, and jewels. But if you want to rule a people, it's better to get everyone on the same page regarding the big metaphysical questions. The Spanish wasted no time converting as many people as they could to Christianity. The Spanish looked at the Mayan people, folks who'd managed to build mind-bendingly impressive pyramids, as violent savages and shameless infidels. When it came to defeating the Mayans, again, New World weapons were no match for Old World weapons. And it didn't help matters at all that the Spanish brought Old World diseases that the people of the New World had no natural resistance to. Smallpox was devastating for the indigenous people of the land. Much has been said about how small armies of Spanish soldiers could beat much larger armies of Aztecs and Mayans, but just sharing the diseases with the locals decimated huge populations. Just as this victim of smallpox said back then, the plague lasted for 70 days, striking everywhere in the city and killing a vast number of our people. Sores erupted on our faces, our breasts, our bellies. We were covered with agonizing sores from head to foot. Add to smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus, and we're talking about a lot of death. Some estimates say disease wiped out 90% of indigenous populations. That might be a high figure, but no one disagrees that European diseases were disastrous for these people. In the centuries to come, the Spanish brought their Inquisition to Mexico. But before we get into that, I have a question for you. How are you feeling? Stressed? Overwhelmed? Lonely? Personally, I'm feeling all of those. I work from home full-time, and no matter how hard I try, I still often end up feeling like I'm trapped in my own little bubble. It's not a great feeling. And I know a lot of you feel the same way about work, school, or just in your personal life. But no matter how you're feeling, you need to know about the sponsor of today's video, BetterHelp. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service, and it's 100% online. With BetterHelp, you can tap into a network of over 25,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with a wide range of issues. To get started, you just answer a few questions about your needs and preferences in therapy. That way, BetterHelp can match you with the right therapist from their network. Then you can talk to your therapist however you feel comfortable, whether it's via text, chat, phone, or video call. You can message your therapist at any time and schedule live sessions when it's convenient for you. If your therapist isn't the right fit for any reason, you can switch to a new therapist at no additional charge. With BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you, more scheduling flexibility, and at a more affordable price. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/infographics. And I've also linked to them below in the description, or scan the QR code. But as we were saying, in the centuries to come, the Spanish brought their Inquisition to Mexico. As was often the case in Europe, one of the reasons was that the Spanish didn't want to lose its tight grip on the population, which was now also full of American-born Spaniards. Spanish rulers weren't so keen on liberal ideas that had been stirring in the minds of many parts of the public during the European Enlightenment, so they cracked down best they could. Still, polarizing was afoot in New Spain. Not everyone was on the same page regarding politics and society, which is important to know today. Excuse us for skipping huge chunks of history here, it's unavoidable. So all we'll say is that inside New Spain, there were people who wanted their liberty from the Spanish. The Liberty Bug was about as contagious as those diseases the Europeans brought to the New World, especially after the United States of America became a thing in 1776, and later Thomas Paine wrote the world-changing book Rights of Man. Revolution was in the air, but it would take New Spain a while to see some major changes. In the early 1800s, a little guy named Napoleon Bonaparte was wreaking havoc all over Europe. First, was he really that short? Well, it depends on where you look. Some sources say he was 5 foot 2 inches, but others say he was more like 5 foot 7. If he was the former, which he probably was, he was average height. though maybe short for an aristocrat. Anyway, on February 16, 1808, he invaded Spain. It's a complicated story, so we'll just say this created shockwaves throughout the Spanish Empire. Napoleon then forced King Ferdinand VII to abdicate, and he put his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, in his place. A lot of folks in New Spain didn't like the new king. Some started forming little groups of rebels that stated independence from Spain was the way ahead. Others said, nah, let's stick with Spain. One of the anti-Spain guys was a priest and revolutionary named Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla. In terms of Mexican history, this man was a lodestar. Costilla had a parish in a place named Dolores. He saw how badly some of his parishioners were treated by the state. He saw how unequal things were. He wanted to end the oppression. He wanted the land to be redistributed to the people. He was serious about espousing real racial equality. Then, on September 16, 1810, he rang the bell at his church. When the people came, he told them now was the time to revolt against these ghastly oppressors. This event is now referred to as the Grito de Dolores, or Cry of Dolores. What started as a strong word in the ears of his parishioners became a full-on war against those snooty upper classes. This is why Costilla is often called the father of Mexican independence. He was executed by firing squad in 1811, but he'd already lit the fuse that would cause the revolutionary fires all over New Spain. The revolutionaries fought in the Mexican War for Independence, which raged for 11 years, 1 week, and 4 days. You know the result already, the Spanish lost. In 1821, the first Mexican Empire was born, an area that stretched from California all the way to the provinces of Central America. The new leaders wrote up the Plan of Iguala, which stated people should have equal rights under a constitutional monarchy while Catholicism should remain the sole religion. One part of the document said, Americans, under which term are included not only those born in America, but Europeans, Africans, and Asians who reside in it. Article 12 said all the inhabitants of the Mexican Empire without any other distinction besides merit and virtue are suitable citizens to apply for any employment. These were tumultuous times, though. Not everyone was on the same page, which is a story you'll be familiar with by the end of the show. Sure, north of the border, the USA had its own internal squabbles too. A bloody awful civil war would kick off there in 1861, but it seemed that the bonfire of disagreement in Mexico could never be doused. Mexico rarely experienced the kind of stability its neighbor did. The first Mexican Empire didn't last long. After only 3 years, the 1824 Constitution of Mexico came into effect after the man who'd been the emperor of the empire, Agustín de Iturbide, was forced into exile. He later returned, only to be executed. He left something behind, though, in the form of the Mexican flag he designed. The Mexican Empire became the United Mexican States. Catholicism was still the main religion, but now Mexico was a republic. Article 74 of the new Constitution said, the supreme executive power of the Federation is deposited in only one individual who shall be called President of the United States of Mexico. In Article 95, it said, the term of the President and Vice President shall be 4 years. Article 123 stated, judiciary power lies in the Supreme Court, the circuit courts, and the district courts. It sounds a lot like the United States, but as you might have guessed, since we're talking about the first Mexican Empire, it makes sense there was more than one. So we'll come to that soon. The Republic had its fair share of problems. One of the problems was a lack of money. This is a place that had not long ago been through a very long and expensive war with Spain. The United States had it easy fighting those Brits compared to the hell that Mexico went through. Even after the Republic was established, there was still profound divisions in society and politics. There were the Federalists who wanted self-governing states. Then there were the Centralists who wanted a central government to rule the roost. Many of the latter said a central government was required to ensure those pesky Spaniards didn't return and try to reclaim Mexico as its own. Many people embraced a more liberal kind of politics, close to what the USA had. And opposing them were folks who preferred a more conservative kind of politics, like in Europe. Each had their own reasons for wanting what they wanted, often selfish. The disagreement led to blood being spilled on many occasions. It led to folks saying elections were rigged, to uprisings, to eventually collapse. Mexico was not getting off to the best of starts. Again, we're skipping a lot of history here, but explaining the entire history of a small village would take us hours, so trying to get through an entire country would be impossible. We should mention a man named Antonio López de Santa Anna, though. He was president of the United Mexican States multiple times, being in charge in total for about 22 years. And when he wasn't in charge, he was always important. Under him, Mexico lost a lot of its territory, so he has a prominent place in this show today. Some say his policies were the reason why Mexico lost Texas after the Texas Revolution of 1835. In short, European colonists and Hispanic Texans, Tejanos, opposed the government of Mexico, and with it, Mr. Santa Anna. It's important to note that Mexico had abolished slavery already, and those folks in Texas didn't like that. This was a significant reason for the split. Although the U.S. was pulling a lot of strings in the background, the Mexicans eventually lost control and the Republic of Texas was born. This later became part of the USA. The Anglo-Americans, who made up most of the population of Texas, were happy to be annexed by the U.S., but the Mexicans were certainly not happy about giving up the territory. Not only that, but American politicians were calling for more Mexican territory to be annexed, including Oregon and California. Democrat James K. Polk even offered hard cash for Mexican territories, but Mexico rebuffed the offer. Polk put $25 million on the table, and the Mexican leaders told the U.S. where they could stuff it. They still didn't recognize the annexation of Texas. This led to the Mexican-American War, and Mexico lost again. After 1 year, 9 months, 1 week, and 1 day of fighting, Mexico relinquished over half its territory. This included Arizona, Colorado, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and parts of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Wyoming. The Mexican army had also been no match for the American army, another reason for Mexico's later struggle. As Ulysses S. Grant, the man who would become the American president and fought in the Mexican War, said, "The Mexican army of that day was hardly an organization. The private soldier was picked from the lower class of the inhabitants when wanted. His consent was not asked. He was poorly clothed, worse fed, and seldom paid. He was turned adrift when no longer wanted." The officers of the lower grades were but little superior to the men. To say the morale of the leading people in Mexico was a little bit shot would be an understatement. This was a country that was very powerful, and now it seemed like its legs and arms had been broken. The USA was on the up and Mexico was floundering. It didn't help matters at all that inside Mexico there was a great schism in terms of how people thought the country should be ruled. As we said, the US had its own form of internal strife, especially when it came to matters such as slavery, but the US exploited Mexico's instability when it could, and it has to be said that in the slave states of the US, oppressed masses of slaves were putting money in the pockets of the American people. As we noted already, if there was the first Mexican empire, then there must have been a second. Now the USA was such a threat that Mexico didn't mind looking for a bit of help. So Mexican conservatives, the clergy, and many of the very wealthy folks in Mexico called the French for help, hoping they could turn the fate of their country around. From 1861 to 1867, the Second Franco-Mexican War was fought, and the French came out on top despite the U.S. offering some support for the Mexican Republicans. France was a threat to the U.S., but the U.S. had its own issues to deal with in regard to the Civil War. So the Second Mexican Empire was born, and the French sent over a guy named Austrian Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian to become emperor. The US couldn't intervene, but it didn't have to, because inside Mexico plenty of people were still allied to the Republic. Yet again, there was lots of fighting. The empire was no more in 1867, and the emperor found out what bullets from a firing squad felt like. The Republic was subsequently restored. In 1876, a military general named Porfirio Diaz became president of Mexico. He served 7 terms in all, making him the leader of the country for a grand total of 31 years. Some of that age-old instability disappeared under him, and Mexico's economy started to grow. Nonetheless, he was a dictator, and while many wealthy Mexicans did indeed get richer, many of the people at the bottom of the pile of society suffered. As Diaz got older, the elites got richer under him. Newly educated students in Mexico started saying this guy's iron grip on the country is unfair. They demanded change. One thing that bugged them the most was that he'd basically sold the country out to the Americans over his leadership of 3 decades. That was good for him and some of the other Mexican elites and American interests, but not good for the majority of the Mexican people. It certainly did not help the country of Mexico to become more powerful on the world stage. In an article about Diaz, Politico wrote, "Over 3 decades in power, Diaz had been strongly aligned with American economic interests, which came to control 90% of Mexico's mineral resources, its national railroad, its oil industry, and increasingly its land." Not surprisingly, there was another revolution in Mexico, which ended with an intellectual and reformist being made the new president. He was Francisco Madero, the man who said Mexico was ready for democracy. He was helped by many revolutionary figures, notably by Pancho Villa, a hero to many Mexican people. The thing with social justice is not everyone has the same ideas of what justice is. And as you're probably now figuring out, Mexico is a country that has always been a hotbed of disharmony when it comes to political ideas. Once Madero was in charge, some revolutionaries complained that he was not doing the radical reforming he said he would. One of Madero's allies secretly wanted to be the president and so started propagating rumors that Madero's leadership was a total failure. Madero was disliked by many, and even though he seemed like an honest man, there was still lots of corruption in his administration, something that had plagued Mexico and would go on to plague Mexico. At this point, rebellions were again afoot in Mexico. Madero was all about land reform and political freedom, which sometimes was at odds with what the U.S. wanted. That created hostility from over the border, leading to U.S.-led propaganda stirring up hatred toward Madero. It was an outright regime change, which would become the U.S.'s modus operandi all over the planet, but it was enough to create a lot of anger toward Madero. Again, Mexico was strewn with people at odds with each other, so there was little harmony in the country. In 1913, the American ambassador to Mexico, Henry Lane Wilson, got together with Madero's opponents and they talked about a coup. Wilson, it seems, saw Madero as a threat to the U.S. An academic paper on the matter explains Wilson's idea of diplomacy was what his administration called dollar diplomacy. U.S. relationships with other countries were based on what economic advantage they could supply. This kind of relationship with the U.S. didn't always work out well for Mexico, in spite of Madero certainly not being perfect. A coup happened in 1913, and Mr. Madero was executed after General Victoriano Huerta took over the reins. He had been described time and again as a murderous thug. While the U.S. had been partly behind the coup, when President Woodrow Wilson came to power, he refused to acknowledge Huerta as the rightful leader of Mexico. Wilson said there would never have been a coup if it wasn't for U.S. surreptitious involvement, so he was not exactly proud about a murderous thug coming to power. It's complicated, but behind-the-scenes politics always is. Let's just say that the violence and division didn't stop once Huerta was on the scene. The skullduggery in Mexico seemed to know no limits, something that all the time hurt the people that needed a stable government the most: the educated students, the working classes, and the peasant farmers. The latter especially never seemed to get a break, so you can understand why they would often resent their leaders. Alright, so let's recap here. We have centuries of turmoil involving the Spanish and the French. The country was dangerously split politically just about all the time, and matters were often not settled at the voting booth, but with rebellions and executions. As time went on, Mexico was plagued with politicians who favored only the wealthy, while the poor could hardly sustain their lives. It's not surprising that there were so many rebel groups in Mexico, and it's equally not surprising that some of those rebels are still sung about today. Even some of the modern rebels, the ones without a cause, are celebrated in song. We're talking about the cartels, entities that rose like knives from the ground. These people started gaining power after decades of the elites treating the poorest people in Mexico like dirt. We're certainly not defending the cartels, since they often do despicable things, but you can't ignore why such lawlessness came about. People aren't usually born bad, they're made bad. It's not to say they should do bad. It was the same in Sicily with the Italian mafia. If social conditions are rotten enough and the people lose all hope in governance, you can bet your bottom dollar that parts of the populace will arm themselves. And just like the Italian mafia infiltrated all levels of Italian society and government, the Mexican cartels infiltrated the higher echelons of Mexican politics. After occasionally throwing the poorer people some bones, where the authorities had thrown them nothing, they even gained some popular support. So this created chaos in Mexico, a chaos that remains today. Still, let's not forget that Mexico is a relatively rich nation. Just a few years ago, it had the 11th largest GDP in the world. Right now, it lies at about 15th place. We say about as these lists are not always the same. Still, Mexico is pretty wealthy. It just has one of the worst wealth gaps on the planet. Income inequality in Mexico is infamous, and as you can imagine, all the people at the top aren't always ready to sacrifice their own wealth for the greater good. If you go back in time, you can see the cracks that led to this. When the European Anglo settlers went to the USA, they were at least treated with some kind of equality by the people already there. Sure, the Native Americans were treated horrifically, but the Spanish down below in New Spain embraced a kind of caste system. It was near impossible for many people to work their way out of poverty. On the other hand, in the US, hard work could indeed mean you could aspire to something. This caste system in Mexico always led to a large part of the population demanding changes. Whatever you think about the British Empire, it was arguably a fairer place than the Spanish Empire. It had a model for society that could be worked with. We could argue that life was a bit easier for the average US citizen than it was for the average Mexican citizen, even though back in the day Mexico was much more developed than the early colonies were in the US. The Spanish model wasn't conducive to creating a great society. While many people in the US were working toward creating a better life for themselves, a lot of the people in Mexico struggled because they were always oppressed. Many of them turned to crime. Many became bandits simply because they knew full well that life for them was rigged from the start. We are generalizing, of course, but there's truth in what we're saying. With all those expensive wars, all those corrupt politicians, and all that territory lost, proceeding to American companies buying up much of Mexico, you can see why the US thrived while Mexico struggled. In more modern history, the US hasn't seen anywhere near as much corruption from a greedy elite. On top of this, to remain a superpower, the US has intervened in politics all over the world, as you know, including Mexico. While Mexico was busy having coups and suffering the consequences of corruption, the US was taking care of its economic interests. As one Mexican guy said writing about this, "We lack imperialistic traits or even the desire to exert a lot of control over others." The US has spent an age developing its economic interests, which is one of the reasons it's so powerful now, although one could argue that some of the conflicts and secret interventions haven't helped at all. Still, the US has never taken its foot off the pedal. To extend that metaphor, Mexico started in a bigger car with a bigger engine with more possibilities, but the drivers of the car failed to take that car in the right direction. The leaders were often content enough just having a luxury car in the first place. Today in Mexico, a good part of the public still distrusts the local and national government, the police, and the military. A 2020 Freedom House report said this: "Official corruption remains a serious problem. The billions of dollars in illegal drug money that enter the country each year from the United States profoundly affects politics, as does rampant public contract fraud and other forms of siphoning off state funds." It can still be a tough place to live for activists or journalists if they're reporting on corruption, and still today many people are living on wages that make day-to-day life extremely hard, despite Mexico being quite the wealthy place. Human rights abuses are common, and the criminal justice system is plagued with pervasive bribery, so it's sometimes hard for people to safely point out the wrongs in society. This is holding Mexico back in terms of becoming the kind of power that moves forward with the people behind it. Here's part of a report from a few years ago. 3 Mexican governors have been arrested in 2017 after fleeing justice, and nearly 90% of the country's citizens see the government as deeply corrupt. It's hard to become a superpower when a country has so much internal discord. Still, we found this more positive report from 2021. Beneath Mexico's fractious left-right political divide lies a more fundamental division between establishment elites and a growing movement of citizens and victims pushing back against criminal violence and gross human rights violations. Unfairness has certainly been one of the main reasons for Mexico never becoming a world power, and it had the potential for that and squandered it. But history is a work in progress, and we imagine someone might watch the show in many years to come and say, "Oh my God, how things have changed." Whether they have changed for the better or worse, we can't say. Now you need to watch Is It Safe to Live in Mexico? Or have a look at all the insane ways El Chapo has escaped prison.